The grave robbery, the flood, and the DNA secret that can rewrite Wild West history. You're standing in a dusty New Mexico cemetery, wind blowing across the high desert, looking at a weathered headstone that might or might not mark the grave of one of the Wild West's most famous outlaws. For over a century, people have argued about whether Billy the Kid really died at Fort Sumner in 1881. Some say he escaped. Some say the body buried there belongs to someone else. And some say the real Billy the Kid lived out his days under a fake name, dying peacefully in bed decades later. Modern DNA technology seemed like it could finally answer that question once and for all. Scientists can identify Egyptian mummies from 3,000 years ago. They can solve century-old murders with just a fragment of bone or a single hair pulled from an envelope. They can trace ancestry back generations with a cheek swab. So why can't we definitively prove who Billy the Kid was and where he's buried? The answer is more complicated than you might think, and it involves grave robberies, courthouse politics, devastating floods, stolen markers, and the uncomfortable reality that sometimes science runs into walls that have nothing to do with lab equipment. Walls made of legal opposition, ethical concerns, and a 1904 flood that may have scattered Billy's bones across a cemetery that no longer exists in its original form. We're going to walk through every serious DNA attempt that's been made to identify Billy the Kid, what the scientists actually found, why each attempt failed, and why this particular Wild West mystery might never get the CSI treatment everyone's hoping for. The problem with Billy the Kid. Before we dive into the graveyard drama, let's talk about why DNA even matters in Billy's case. When Sheriff Pat Garrett shot someone at Pete Maxwell's house on July 14, 1881, he said it was Billy the Kid. Simple, right? Case closed? Not even close. The body was buried quickly in the dark within 24 hours. No formal inquest, no photographs of the corpse, no autopsy. Just a hole in the ground and a wooden marker that wouldn't last the decade. Conflicting witness statements swirled about whether the dead man even looked like Billy. Some said it was him. Others weren't so sure. Over the decades, several men stepped forward claiming to be the real Billy, the one who somehow escaped that night. The most persistent claimants were an Arizona man named John Miller, who died in 1937, and an Oklahoma man who called himself Brushy Bill Roberts, who made his claim in 1948. Both had stories that convinced some people and infuriated others. Now, if you're trying to prove someone's identity more than a century after their death, DNA is your gold standard. The most useful type for old remains is mitochondrial DNA, which passes down through the maternal line unchanged for generations. That means, if you could get DNA from Billy's mother and compare it to DNA from whoever's buried in that Fort Sumner grave, you'd have your answer. Simple, right? Digesem fluorunt. In 1995, researchers did exactly this with another Wild West outlaw. They successfully exhumed the remains of a man buried as Jesse James and compared his DNA to samples from living maternal relatives descended from Jesse's sister. The results weren't quite as definitive as people often claim, but they were close enough. The bones themselves were too poorly preserved to yield DNA, but teeth and hair samples recovered in 1978 from the original burial site did provide usable mitochondrial DNA. When compared to blood samples from two of Jesse's maternal relatives, the sequences matched. The researchers concluded this supported the identification. Though they acknowledged there was still a remote possibility, the remains could belong to a different maternal relative or an unrelated person with the same mitochondrial sequence. Still, that case became the model for what everyone thought could be done with Billy the Kid. If it worked for Jesse, why not Billy? But there's a crucial difference. Jesse James died in 1882, just 1 year after Billy. But Jesse's grave stayed in one identifiable location. The family tree was well documented. They had multiple living relatives with confirmed maternal lineage. Billy's case had none of those advantages, and that's where the problems started piling up. The mother problem. The first major DNA proposal came in 2003 when Lincoln County Sheriff Tom Sullivan, Capitan Mayor Steve Setterwall, and Abaca County Sheriff Gary Graves began pushing to exhume Catherine Antrim, who was most likely Billy's mother. Catherine died in 1874 and was buried in Silver City, New Mexico. The plan was straightforward. Dig up Catherine, extract her mitochondrial DNA, then compare it to remains from both the Fort Sumner grave marked as Billy the Kid and from the bodies of the men who claimed to be Billy later in life. The proposal sparked immediate controversy. Local historians and cemetery officials in Silver City were not enthusiastic about disturbing a grave that had been undisturbed for over 125 years. Some argued it was disrespectful to Catherine's memory to treat her burial site as a science experiment. Others pointed out the legal complications. Exhuming human remains requires court approval and a compelling reason beyond satisfying historical curiosity. There was also debate about whether Catherine Antrim was even definitely Billy's mother. Most historians accept that she was, but the documentary record from the 1870s is sparse. Billy himself rarely talked about his mother in any surviving letters or testimony. Catherine's own background is frustratingly unclear. She might have been Catherine McCarty when she died, or Catherine Antrim, depending on which marriage was legally valid. The uncertainty about her identity created enough legal gray area that courts were reluctant to authorize an exhumation. The Catherine Antrim proposal faced fierce resistance from Fort Sumner and Silver City officials. Legal challenges piled up, and in September 2004, the petition was withdrawn. No shovels touched dirt. No DNA samples were taken. The whole effort eventually died without any official decision. The Fort Sumner nightmare. But even if researchers had gotten permission to exhume Catherine, they'd still face the Fort Sumner problem, and this is where things get really messy. The original Fort Sumner Cemetery, where Billy was supposedly buried in 1881, doesn't exist in its original form anymore. In October 1904, the Pecos River flooded catastrophically. The floodwaters covered the cemetery with approximately 4 feet of water, washing away markers and creating chaos in the burial grounds. Some sources claim the flood exposed and redistributed remains, though recent historical research suggests this might be exaggerated. What we know for certain is that Billy's wooden grave marker had already been stolen years before the flood, so his grave was unmarked when the disaster struck. After the flood, all the wooden markers in the cemetery were gone. For over 2 decades, Billy's grave remained unmarked, and its exact location became uncertain. It wasn't until the late 1920s and early 1930s that efforts were made to relocate Billy's grave. In 1930, 4 men set out to find the exact spot. 3 of them, Porfirio Anaya, Antonio Silva, and Jesus Silva, had actually known Billy the Kid and were present the night he died. They helped prepare his body for burial and served as pallbearers. The 4th man, Charles Fury, arrived at Fort Sumner just months after Billy's death when the grave was still fresh. Based on their recollections, a marker was placed in what they believed was the correct location. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Even with eyewitnesses trying to remember a grave location from 50 years earlier, there's no guarantee they got it right. A 1906 map, drawn by Charles Dudra when he exhumed soldiers' remains from the cemetery, provides some guidance. But whether the current grave marker sits exactly over Billy's remains is still debated by historians. There have been attempts over the years to exhume the Fort Sumner grave. In 2003, Sheriff Tom Sullivan petitioned to dig up the grave marked as Billy. New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson initially seemed supportive, even appointing an attorney to represent the interests of Billy the Kid himself in court proceedings. The plan was to compare DNA from the Fort Sumner remains with DNA from Brushy Bill Roberts and John Miller to settle the imposter question once and for all. But Fort Sumner residents weren't having it. The gravesite is a major tourist attraction, bringing visitors and revenue to a small town that doesn't have many other draws. Local officials argued that even if DNA testing was scientifically sound, disturbing the grave would be disrespectful and potentially damage the remains further. Mayor Raymond Lopez said he had attorneys coming out of the woodwork on a pro bono basis to fight the exhumation. The proposal stalled in legal challenges and eventually died when the petitioners withdrew their request in September 2004. Here's the reality. Even if you could dig up that grave tomorrow with full legal authority, you might pull out bones that have nothing to do with Billy the Kid. The uncertainty created by the flood, the missing markers, and decades of grave robberies means that the Fort Sumner Cemetery is essentially a historical question mark wrapped in a legal nightmare. The impostors couldn't brave now. Let's talk about the DNA attempts that actually happened, or at least came close to happening. The most publicized effort involved John Miller, one of the men who claimed to be Billy the Kid. Miller died in 1937 and was buried at the Arizona Pioneers Home Cemetery in Prescott. In May 2005, his body was exhumed with permission from facility administrators who had sole authority over the cemetery under Arizona law. The exhumation itself was legitimate, and researchers did extract bone samples for DNA testing. But here's where it fell apart. They had nothing reliable to compare it to. Without DNA from Catherine Antrim or confirmed remains from Fort Sumner, the Miller DNA was just genetic material from an unidentified person. The test couldn't prove or disprove anything about Billy the Kid. They could tell you what John Miller's mitochondrial DNA looked like, but they couldn't tell you if it matched Billy's because there was no Billy sample to match it against. The investigators, Sheriff Sullivan and Mayor Sutterwall, said they had another plan. They claimed to have located a bench on which Billy's body was placed after he was shot, and they said they recovered blood samples from this bench. Forensic expert Dr. Don Henry Lee successfully extracted DNA from these samples according to their statements. The idea was to compare the bench blood with Miller's DNA, and if that didn't match, they'd move on to exhuming Brushy Bill Roberts in Texas. But there are serious problems with this courthouse blood story. Even if the blood was real and not just rust stains or other discoloration, there was no reliable chain of custody proving it came from Billy the Kid. DNA degrades over time, especially when exposed to light, air, and temperature changes. Blood on a wooden bench that sat exposed for potentially 140 years would be heavily contaminated and degraded. While Dr. Lee may have extracted something proving that material was from Billy the Kid, much less using it for reliable comparison is essentially impossible. These samples never led to any conclusive results or published findings. The investigation went nowhere, and the DNA from John Miller remains an unanswered question in a freezer somewhere. The artifact problem. There have been other rumored artifacts over the years. Hair supposedly from Billy that someone kept in a locket, blood-stained clothing allegedly from the night he died, even claims about biological material preserved on old photographs. Every single one of these fails the basic requirements for forensic DNA testing. You need provenance, documented proof of where the sample came from, who handled it, and how it was stored. You need proper storage conditions to minimize degradation. You need uncontaminated material, which is almost impossible with items that have been handled, displayed, passed down through families, and exposed to environmental conditions for more than a century. Modern forensic experts have been pretty clear about this. The Jesse James case, while considered a success, illustrated just how difficult 140-year-old DNA analysis can be. The bones themselves yielded nothing usable. Only teeth and hair that had been recovered and presumably stored with some care provided results. And even then, the scientists acknowledged limitations in their conclusions. Billy the Kid researchers don't have that luxury. There are no carefully preserved samples with clear chain of custody. There are no living relatives with confirmed maternal lineage. There's just a flooded cemetery, a disputed grave, and the decaying bones of a woman who might be Billy's mother buried in a plot that no one wants to disturb. Where Stalvini stand today? So where does that leave us? What's the current scientific consensus on whether DNA could solve the Billy the Kid mystery? The answer is, it depends on what you mean by could. Technically, yes, DNA testing could identify Billy the Kid's remains if you had the right samples. If researchers could exhume Catherine Antrim, extract good quality mitochondrial DNA from her bones, and then exhume remains that were definitively from the Fort Sumner grave in 1881, a comparison would tell you whether that body was Catherine's child. If you could also get DNA from John Miller, Brushy Bill Roberts, and any other impostors, you could rule them in or out as well. But the technical possibility isn't the issue. The barriers are legal, ethical, and historical. New Mexico courts have consistently declined to authorize exhumations related to Billy the Kid. Local communities that benefit from Billy the Kid tourism don't want graves disturbed. The fundamental uncertainty about which bones are which, thanks to that 1904 flood, stolen markers, and decades of cemetery mismanagement, means even a successful exhumation might not give you reliable results. There's also a question of priorities. Is solving a 140-year-old outlaw mystery important enough to override the general principle that we should leave graves undisturbed? Reasonable people disagree on that. Some argue that historical truth matters and that Billy the Kid is a significant enough figure in American history to justify the research. Others say he was a criminal who killed people, and we should leave the dead alone regardless of how famous they were. The final verdict. So here's the truth after looking at all the DNA evidence, or rather the lack of it. DNA testing could theoretically answer some questions about Billy the Kid, whether he really died in 1881, whether any of the impostors were legitimate, possibly even whether certain photographs actually show him. But those answers require samples we don't have and probably will never get permission to collect. The real barriers aren't in the laboratory. They're in the courtroom, the cemetery, and the tangled web of legal and ethical considerations around disturbing human remains. Every attempt to definitively close the Billy the Kid case runs into missing evidence, destroyed records, or legal roadblocks. DNA isn't a magic solution to historical mysteries when the physical evidence is scattered, degraded, or inaccessible. The paper trail might be all we ever get. Documents can be analyzed without disturbing graves. Photographs can be enhanced and compared. Witness statements can be cross-referenced. None of that will give you the absolute certainty of a DNA match, but it's what we're working with, and honestly, it might have to be enough. Maybe that's fitting for Billy the Kid. He spent his whole life evading capture and leaving confusion in his wake. Whether he meant to or not, he created a mystery that outlived him by more than a century, and modern science, for all its power, still can't crack it. The grave robbers couldn't find him. The flood couldn't wash him away completely. The courts couldn't authorize his exhumation. And the DNA, the most powerful tool we have, sits useless without the samples it needs. Billy the Kid won, not by escaping, but by becoming so thoroughly buried in uncertainty that even 21st century science can't dig him out. What do you think? Should researchers keep pushing for DNA testing, even if it means exhuming graves and fighting legal battles? Or is it time to accept that some historical mysteries just can't be solved? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you stand on this. And if you found this deep dive into the DNA evidence useful, hit that subscribe button. We've got more Billy the Kid investigations coming, looking at everything from his disputed photographs to the recent theories about who really shot him that night in Fort Sumner. Thanks for watching.